Well, hello there. Today we're talking about Gustavo Gutierrez, who's known as the father of liberation theology. Gustavo Gutierrez is from Peru. He was born in Lima, Peru, the capital city, in 1928. And when Gutierrez was in his 20s, he had the opportunity to go to Europe and study there. He studied for some years at Leuven University in Belgium, and then he moved to France to study for some more years. And it was during his time in France that Gutierrez comes under the influence of the Nouvelle theologians, Henry de Lubac specifically, Yves Congar, and a few others. And it's also there that Gutierrez is influenced by the thought of Karl Rahner. Although he had not met Rahner, who was in Germany, he is very interested by Rahner's understanding of the possibility of salvation outside the institutional church. Gutierrez will also be quite influenced by the thought of Jürgen Moltmann. Now, things were moving quickly in Europe in the Catholic Church during the 50s and into the 60s. It was in 1960 that the Vatican II Council was convened. Gutierrez was back in Peru at this time, but he watched carefully as the events unfolded at the Vatican II Council from 1960 to 1964. Almost immediately after that, a council was convened of all of the Latin American bishops to try to figure out what the Vatican II Council had for South America. And so they gathered in order to work out the principles of Vatican II in a way that would be relevant to the Latin American context. Gutierrez was a consultant at this conference in Medellin, Colombia. This was from 1965 to 1968. Pope Paul IV played an important part for Gutierrez because he was at the Vatican Council. He was the one who had called the Vatican Council, and then he also appeared at the Medellin Conference, the first time a pope had ever traveled to Latin America. And this was a big thing, and this shapes Gutierrez's life for the rest of his life. It's 3 years after this conference that his landmark book, A Theology of Liberation, is published, and it's that book that launches liberation theology as a movement. One thing that Gutierrez learned when he was in Europe is that theology is always contextual. He studied under some great minds, and he learned some very great 20th century ideas, but Gutierrez realized that those ideas were not right for his context. They wouldn't work just as they were. He was going to have to adapt those ideas that he had learned to his own context in Peru if Peruvians were to make sense of them. For Gutierrez, he realizes that the context in Europe is very different from the context in Latin America. Europe was becoming secularized. Theology was concerned with issues of nature and grace and how to convince persons who had moved beyond Christianity how to recognize the importance of Christianity. In Latin America, the situation was very different. Catholicism was the dominant faith, and while many persons were religious, the problem there was poverty. It was not non-religion, it was the problems of poverty and the fact that the church didn't seem to do much about it. In fact, even stronger, the church seemed to side with the established order against those who were poor during this time. And so Gutierrez realizes he must take these European ideas and adapt them to his own context. For Gutierrez, he thinks that in Europe, the main problem is the non-believer. How to bring non-Christians, those who had moved beyond Christianity into secularity, back into the Christian faith. The main problem in Latin America is the non-person. How to reach out to those who were left behind because of their poverty and affirm to them their full humanity as persons. So Gutierrez looks at the discussions about nature and grace that he saw developed in Henry de Lubac and in Karl Rahner, and he thinks that their focus was on purely spiritual salvation, oriented at those who were secular. Gutierrez wants to focus on those who are non-persons, and so he takes that nature-grace issue and he applies it to holistic salvation. That is, nature and grace are not so far distinguished. In fact, God is working in the natural order among human beings, and he's working within that to save human beings. Salvation is both, then, a salvation from poverty and a salvation from sin, and both together are what holistic salvation is really all about. For Gutierrez, this puts new focuses in theology. He calls it a preferential option for the poor, that those who are poor are the ones in which all Christians must reach out with, to, and identify with in order to themselves practice their Christian faith. Christianity is always associated with justice. For Gutierrez, to know God is to work for justice. There's no other way to reach God, Gutierrez thinks. And for Gutierrez, that means turning around the whole project of theology to recognize that theology starts with practice rather than with theory. What he means is that first, the priority is on the lived Christian experience. We act in justice. We act toward our neighbor. And then, as we do that, then we begin to, on a second level, think theologically. We order our thoughts into reasonable doctrines of Christianity in ways that then reflect the practice of our Christian faith. So praxis is first, and then doctrine follows. In this new theological method, where praxis leads and theological reflection follows, then, salvation should be identified with liberation. Now, Gutierrez defines salvation as the communion of human beings with God and among themselves. Notice that definition, how it gets at the wholeness of salvation. It's the communion of human beings with God and among themselves. So salvation is taking place when human beings are reconciled to each other and are reconciled to God, and where there's holistic life and health going on, both physically and spiritually. Gutierrez reminds us that the Bible always seems to talk about salvation on both physical and spiritual levels. After all, the Exodus from Egypt was a physical event. There were people being saved from Egypt. And then the death of Christ is something that freed persons spiritually. God's movement in history is an eschatological one. That is, God's plan is of holistic salvation. It will be worked out in future times, but we must work at it now to begin to make it a reality. We don't achieve that in our own strength, but the plan of salvation is always a holistic plan in which both spiritual salvation and physical wholeness go together. And God will accomplish that eschatologically in His own time. Now, this means that liberation as salvation must have different levels, of course, because at the very bottom level is that socioeconomic level. Gutierrez says we have to start there. It's freedom from material poverty. Where there is material poverty, a person is a non-human, and flourishing in life is not happening. And so there's need to help that person be liberated from their material situation. But of course, that's not good enough, and Gutierrez realizes that's not the wholeness of salvation. One can be rich and still be poor in salvation. So Gutierrez talks about a second level, that utopian historical level. This is freedom when human beings assume their responsibility for their own destiny. Notice that this is a level beyond simply the socioeconomic level. Persons then have some agency in life. The final level here is theological purely. It's freedom from sin. Now, this ultimately is the most important thing in salvation as liberation. It's the kind of liberation that everyone needs, whether rich or poor. But notice that Gutierrez will not separate this one off from the others. Salvation is always holistic, and we must always work toward salvation in a holistic way, that is, toward the practical needs of others as well as the spiritual needs of others. Now, Gutierrez sees here Jesus as liberator and the church as the sacrament of liberation. Gutierrez separates three distinct ages of the church as he sees it. First of all was Christendom, that is, when the church had political power. It was united with the state, and it was on the side of political power. Gutierrez sees all kinds of dangers there because the church naturally wanted to uphold itself, and it wanted to uphold the established order, so it sided with those who were in power, leaving injustice sometimes for those who were not in power. A new stage came with the French Revolution and those revolutions in Europe around the same time, and some in Latin America. That is New Christendom. The church is losing political power, but the church still wants to hold on to some power, and so it's struggling within itself to come to understand itself in this new reality in which church and state are becoming separate, but the church wants to hold on to some kind of political power. This reaches its next stage in the distinction of planes, as Gutierrez calls it. That is, that the church ends up only having spiritual power. Now, this is not necessarily a good thing because the church begins to think of itself as simply a medium for spiritual salvation. It forgets all about its task of wholeness of salvation, and it begins to think only in terms of spiritual salvation. The government, the state, will offer material wellness. The church offers only spiritual things. Gutierrez wants to recapture both, and so he understands the church as sacrament of liberation. That is, the church always have to make a decision about which side they're on. The church can fail to act as a sacrament of liberation by standing up for the established order against the poor, or those in the church can make a stand with those who are poor and therefore be the sacrament of liberation as they stand holistically for the salvation and wholeness of persons. Now, all of this leads Gutierrez to emphasize what he calls a preferential option for the poor. That is, in the church, there must always be a preferential option, a special focus on the poor in order for Christians to be Christians, for them to act out their Christian faith by siding with the poor in holistic salvation. The Medellin Conference and Gutierrez distinguish between three levels then of poverty. On the first level, they're talking about material poverty. Material poverty, as the Bible seems to describe it, is always bad. It's an evil that prevents human flourishing from happening. They don't have the basics of life. Gutierrez calls this death before one's time. A person can't really live until they have the things necessary for life. But on the other hand, poverty can actually be a good thing. In a sense, poverty can raise our awareness of God, can focus us on our need for God. And so there's always been a tradition in the Christian church of persons giving up their wealth and becoming poor for the sake of the kingdom of God. It goes all the way back to Jesus telling persons to sell what they have and give it to the poor. This is what we call spiritual poverty, and this is a good thing. Material poverty sometimes deepens our spirituality. And so we can't think that poverty is always a bad thing. Material poverty, when one lacks what they need, is always a bad thing. But poverty, in the sense of spiritual poverty, is not such a bad thing. And so, in that sense, also there's a preferential option for the poor. Those who are poor have more awareness of their need for God. They have more space for faith in their lives. Now, at the third level, then, is poverty as commitment. Siding with the poor, Gutierrez says, is not simply one of the things Christians do, and it's not an optional thing for Christians. It's the essence of Christian faith. We must side with those who are poor. We must take sides where injustice is being done. That's of the very center of Christian faith. So in all three ways, then, there's a preferential option for the poor. First, with material poverty, we recognize that poverty keeps and prevents human flourishing from occurring, we have to stop that. Secondly, where there's spiritual poverty, we recognize there's a preferential option for the poor, in that those persons have a heightened recognition of their spiritual need and an awareness of God. They're better candidates for God's saving work because they're more willing to accept God's saving work. And thirdly, then, the challenge goes out for all Christians, this preferential option for the poor. This is of the essence of the Christian faith. It's not an optional task. Now, Gutierrez has certainly been criticized for equating salvation with liberation, because theologians worry that too much emphasis on material liberation puts too much focus on salvation as human living now, and not enough on the spiritual aspect of the person. Gutierrez, though, I think escapes most of that criticism. Here's a quote that helps us understand his rationale for a theology of liberation. The ultimate reason for a commitment to the poor and oppressed does not lie in social analysis. As Christians, we base that commitment fundamentally on the God of our faith. It's a theocentric, prophetic option we make, one which strikes its roots deep in the gratuity of God's love and is demanded by that love. So for Gutierrez, the focus is on the very nature of God, and we as Christians responding to God's love by tangibly showing love to others, especially those who need it most, physically, and this opens them to spiritual salvation as well. Now, we could ask, what are the results of liberation theology? They are huge. In many cases, liberation theology is what's understood as theology today. The first and probably biggest point that liberation theologians brought to the whole theological community is that all theology is contextualized. Theology does not look the same in all places and for all persons. And the trend right now in theology is to emphasize that point almost exclusively. There are no universal theologies at present. In fact, there are different interest groups who do different theologies for their own communities, and that seems to be the trend of theology at present. A second part, though, that has really caught on, and I'm glad that it has, is that preferential option for the poor. This has been taken up in the Roman Catholic Church as part of their official language. It's been emphasized by the World Council of Churches in new and important ways. Evangelicals are often still a bit concerned about that because they don't want to put too much emphasis on the physical aspect of salvation. We could wonder, though, if evangelicals put too little emphasis on that part of the holistic saving of the human person. A third and final point that I'll mention is a renewed focus on the earthly life of Jesus as contributing to God's saving work. This, along with studies in historical Jesus, has led to a new focus on Jesus' life, Jesus' human actions during this life on behalf of others as part of God's saving mission. And so this emphasis of Christ as liberator is a very central part of the Christian faith that we do see in the Gospels, but has often been overlooked in Christology in favor of some theoretical issues that Gutierrez says may be important, but only at a second level. And it's great to see that theology is refocusing on the narratives of Jesus in the Gospels and seeing how his human life was affecting salvation holistically for those who were outsiders and marginalized. And that, Gutierrez says, is an emphasis for all of us as Christians as well.